Hey, everybody, welcome back to Practical Liberty. My name's Henry Bingaman. This episode's coming out a little later than normal because I just got back from a trip to Puerto Rico. It was kind of a last minute thing. My buddy was heading down there and he said, "Hey, you want to come?" And I said, "Sure, as long as I can interview for the podcast." So we just sat down, we had an informal discussion, and it was a lot of fun. This is the first podcast I've ever done while drinking rum and smoking cigars and outdoors. So there were a couple things that went wrong. For example, I was supposed to have a video component to this, but I spilled a cup of coffee on my laptop the day before recording was supposed to start. So that didn't happen. But I did manage to get the audio. There was also some audio hiccups where a neighbor at the Airbnb we were staying at decided to weed whack their lawn during the middle of our recording. I tried to edit out the sound. I did the best I could. I'm sorry if there's some background noise. There's also a little wind. I'm not a professional audio editor, so I apologize for that. But this was a fun conversation. I think there's actually some valuable stuff in it. It's just a conversation behind the scenes with me and one of my best friends. So anyway, I hope you enjoy listening to it as much as I enjoyed recording it. Hey, everybody, welcome back to Practical Liberty. My name's Henry Bingaman, and this is a special on-the-road edition of Practical Liberty. I am down here in Puerto Rico with one of my best friends, Mr. Joseph Pinto. Joe, what's going on, man?
Not much, brother. Enjoying the view, enjoying the ocean, great weather. Being down here on vacation, what could be wrong?
Yeah, it's not vacation. This is obviously a work trip for me.
Obviously, I did find a way to visit a online website that would tell me where I can purchase vehicles right now. So this is definitely a work trip for the both of us. Absolutely.
So can you kind of introduce yourself to the audience a little bit? Just what you do, why you're able to just take a week off in the middle of your life and hop on down to Puerto Rico?
So I, for years, worked for a car dealership. Was kind of a initial way I got into the business I'm in, and from there got sort of decided at some point that I hated the hours that required. I was always in the management level of it, in the operations on their used car operations. So I managed a bigger auto group in the Philadelphia area. So taking the trade-in vehicles that come in, wholesaling them off at auction, and decided at some point that I was tired of doing that for a company, and decided that I was going to go off and do this with a partner, and we went and started our own idea of doing this. So essentially not incorporating the large machine of the used car industry, but just working on our own.
So what I love about you is, so when I talk about you, I sometimes refer to you as the most American to ever America, because you have a couple side hustles too that we could talk about. You're really into buying and selling guns on kind of a, I don't know, it's not professional basis, but semi-professional basis, I guess you'd call it.
Yeah, I've started a few businesses that both, yeah, I would call them like in-family businesses. So my stepfather has worked for years as a consultant, always pretty much been independent, but as an independent consultant in the software industry, and getting close to retirement, had thought about what he was going to do post his retirement, and got some ideas. We brainstormed, but both of us really enjoy going to the range together, shooting together. For fun, and he's always enjoyed taking new shooters to the range and doing that. So after talking a bunch about it, we both decided that it might be a good idea for him to start a business doing that. So we got into it and went into business and thought about how to start a training business for people that are new shooters that are unfamiliar with it. And the whole kind of genesis of that was the idea that most people who do firearms training end up looking like they belong in the SWAT team, or that they look like they're basically like coming out of SEAL Team 6.
Right? Yeah.
There's sort of no reason for that when you're talking about a suburban housewife or somebody that's, 53 years old, had heard about some crime in the neighborhood, and now wants to just be able to learn how to shoot. That they really need to have that intimidation level of that. And my stepdad is an unopposing looking guy. Also incorporates my mom into the business, which really works out well because she can relate to a lot of people who, again, are getting into this later in life. They're not people who grew up in an entire gun culture, shooting from when they're 6 years old or hunting from when they're a kid and familiar with this. This is somebody who never thought about owning a gun in their life, and then at a young age, or at later age, they've just decided this might be interesting. This might serve me well to own a firearm. They're not the people that have a collection of a safe with 1,000 guns in it or 100 guns in it. This is somebody that literally goes to the store totally unaware of what they should buy, and probably heard somewhere that they should buy a shotgun, but that's another story. It's a more complicated weapon to use in the beginning of learning how to self-defense. But so they go and they've learned how to essentially get some firearms training about how to. The easiest way I could say it is my stepdad teaches them how to not shoot yourself and use your weapon in minimally in a self-defense scenario. So started a business with them with that.
The bullet goes into the other guy, not you, right? That's the main.
Yeah.
No, it's an interesting idea because I think there is a military culture around guns, so much so that it's one of the reasons people find guns so scary is because all they view it as is soldiers shooting, machine guns and actual assault rifles, like legitimate definitions of assault rifles.
Well, yeah, truly, people really think that everybody who has an AR-15 has an assault rifle, and couldn't be farther from the truth. If you look at what an assault rifle does, it's a fully automatic weapon. They've been outlawed since 1968, and the 86 ban put a true end to the ownership of anything that needs to be on a national registry for the government. That's their national registry of firearms.
Honestly, I wish more people had machine guns. Well, first of all, they should. I don't believe in any gun restrictions. I think they're all insane and just clearly unconstitutional. Not that the Constitution actually means much to politicians. But machine guns would not make for good mass shooting weapons. Like the way that they're used, school shootings is what people mean by mass shootings. Like when they use the definition of mass shootings as any person that shoots 4 or more people. But like that happens in Chicago every Thursday night. So people don't think of those as the mass shootings people are scared of are the school shootings.
I mean, take Philadelphia. How many times do you hear shootings there, and they happen with handguns way more often than they do anything else? Right. There's no talk about banning those. Well, there will be at some point, but there's no talk currently about banning those. They're going to go after the low-hanging fruit first. There's less people that own AR-15s, and people think they're scary looking, so all of a sudden that's what you want to go after. We don't tend to go after the handgun category. But when there's no AR-15s to go after, what's the next thing we'll go after at some point?
Yeah, they've got to find something to ban. Otherwise, what are they doing in Washington?
Well, I mean, you can't have Congress have a part-time job. That's not a thing anymore.
But no, it's a great idea to destigmatize that military thing and actually show people what the real purpose of guns are, and it's self-defense. It's not going off, invading Iraq and Afghanistan.
It's certainly not that, and as much as they are used for hunting, it's not about hunting. The reason we own firearms in the United States is not purely for hunting, and it's not even just for self-defense against another person. There's obviously multiple, reasons for self-defense.
I live in the woods. There's bears that walk through my yard. Now they're black bears. You scare them away with a frying pan if you want, but you never know if you get an angry bear or an angry mama bear, because I see the cubs down by the pond all the time with the mama bear, and that's when you just stay in the house.
Looking for the fish that have been gone out of your pond for years now.
Yeah, those jerks ate those fish years ago. Actually, no, it was there was a heron, a blue heron that came down and plucked all those fish out.
That's amazing.
But yeah, the bears were getting the perch and stuff out of the pond, which is, I don't know. So your other business is you buy and sell whiskey barrels? You private label and sell whiskey, right?
So so we started really minor. I mean, it's a very, very, very minor thing at this point. It's more of a monetized hobby. But we have a way to purchase some whiskey barrels, and you can get them white labeled under yourself. So if you have a company, if you have a law firm that wants to essentially give out Christmas gifts, you can purchase your own whiskey barrel, have an experience, go to Kentucky, buy a bunch of whiskey, bring it back and receive it essentially to you bottled. It can come multiple ways. It can come from the distillery with a side label, or and of course there's tons and tons of regulations on how things have to get labeled and whatnot, and all by the government, because they tell you what you should have on your labels for your whiskey. But there's that, or you can essentially get it white labeled as well, and you can create any brand you want for it as long as it's not already taken somewhere.
So how did you get so into whiskey? I remember it was, 10 years ago or something. It was a couple years after we had met, and our friend Frank is like, "Oh, do you want to do this whiskey tasting thing?" Joe is one of the judges. So you've been into whiskey for a long time, and you have a developed palate for it, I should say, and you have a lot of knowledge around it. How'd you get started in that?
Well, what we're drinking right now kind of leads into that. But believe it or not, before I was into whiskey, I was hugely into rum. Always thought rum was really interesting. And no, not the Bacardi you're finding on the shelf, or the Don Q, or the standard stuff that just sits on a shelf. Most of that stuff is essentially sugar-made vodka, which I'm going to have to go into definitions of how you make it, but essentially it's like industrial rum. So they distill it up to a very, very, very high proof, strip all the flavor out of it, and essentially turn it into vodka, because vodka can be made from anything that you can distill, essentially potatoes, grains, sugar, but they just happen to call it rum at that point, and they add a little, they leave a little bit left in the flavor when they strip all the flavors out of it. But was usually into the market of rum, where rum can really be incredible spirit, just really hard to find in the United States, as we're just not the rum market. Essentially, Europe is where great rum kind of exists, but even there, it's a very, very, very micro category of spirits. The rum drinker's the weirdo. Got into that. At some point, these categories of whiskey, brandy, and rum sort of all seem to be in an ebb and flow at some point, where you dive in on one spirit, and then you have a friend that happens to drink that with you and says, "Have you had this?" And you have a friend who has it, and they pour some, and you try theirs, and all of a sudden you go down the rabbit hole, and you have thousands of bottles at home of spirits. That's another category we can go into. But yeah, so you'll end up with that. So I really got into it there. I had some friends that were into it. There's actually a Facebook group called Whiskey Blasphemy, that their entire thing, where there are a bunch of guys who got tired of the rules of how to drink your whiskey, and I kind of got involved with them, made really good friends with the founders of that group, and their group was basically about how not to be pretentious and uppity about your whiskey, not to drink with your pinky up in the air. They made things like, they took Pappy Van Winkle 23 year and made chocolate-covered bacon out of it. They did Johnny Walker Blue Label Jello shots. They did Macallan in recipes, Macallan 25 in recipes. And while it does probably sound kind of pretentious to do that, the whole idea about it was everybody else was doing this and telling you how you had to drink it, and that you weren't allowed to put ice on it, and you can't mix it with Coke. There was a point at which I took a whiskey, and I remember my first post that I put on there was a Talisker 25 year that I made a blue Hawaiian drink out of. Don't know why. It was just fit what they were doing on there already. So thought it was interesting. And then kind of from there, you just meet new people that are always into it. I had a friend that I was good friends with for many years who also sort of got into this at the same time. So it was like a back and forth. It makes it really easy to get into these categories when you have a good friend of yours that's going down the same path at the same time. So we end up purchasing bottles together, tasting bottles together, going to distilleries together, going to different bars together that have all these things, and we end up just trying a whole bunch of stuff. And even when you get into whiskey, there's so many categories. There's bourbon, there's rye. Rye is probably my favorite of the whiskey categories. There's Scotch, and then there's blended Scotch. There's single malt Scotch. There's so many categories and rabbit holes to go down that you kind of get into that. And when you go to a bar, you basically, if you buy 3 drinks at a bar, you've bought the whole bottle. So why not just buy the bottle? So I went down that rabbit hole, and you'd buy the bottle, you'd bring it home, you'd pour 1 or 2 drinks, and then half the time I forget about it because there's the new thing I want to try. There's the new bottle you want to get into. So basically got into it with a bunch of friends who got into it, and then you find that there's a bunch of people that I guess sort of become more reasonable and go, I'm only going to keep 5-10 bottles at home. I didn't take that path.
No, literally in your house, your entire dining room is floor to ceiling shelves of whiskey around it. And, some of the bottles are very nice. Some are just interesting, standard variations of something. It's a very impressive collection.
Yeah, you know what? It's fun for me. It's interesting, and I think to me the point that I really got to that I enjoy the most is being able to share it with people. So most people come into my house and then assume, oh, this guy must be a huge drinker. I got to tell you, I really don't drink during the week. I might have one once in a while, and when I do, it's usually a $23 bottle of Rittenhouse Rye. That's what I'm drinking if I'm going to drink by myself, because I just don't care. The better stuff I'd rather share with people. I'd like to share those experiences with people. I know we had gone on a bachelor party together years ago, and that was the whole idea. Brought a bottle of whiskey that most people aren't going to get to try. It's Pappy Van Winkle. I think it's overrated, but a lot of people hold it in super high regard, and it was interesting that we got to open it up together and share it. But the idea was there's a bunch of people who actually don't know what it is, and we got to share it together without the pretension of, oh, this is the most incredible bourbon in the world. This is, there's just people who didn't know. And I enjoyed doing that with people. I enjoyed tasting people on it, talking about it. And I, and the 1 out of 10, that try things are going to go, wow, this is awesome. I really want to get into this. That to me is what it's about, not the idea of putting the bottle up on my shelf so others can look at.
What's cool about I love that you turned it into a business, because your whiskey habit, and like you said, you don't drink it all that often, but your whiskey habit turned into I'm not saying you make a lot of money doing it, but it probably pays for itself, right?
Yeah, I've let it be sustainable. And there's a whole nother market to the way I kind of got into the whiskey quote unquote business, I guess, was really buying and flipping bottles at some point. So that was a huge beginning into this. And it's both fun because I've always been really business minded. I've always tried to find a way to make something into a business that I could, or turn away. I don't know. I guess the car dealership thing. If you think about it, I was a young age. I remember I bought an Audi when I was 18 years old. Drove it for a few months, did some things to it, and then sold it. And I remember making a profit on that car and thinking, well, this is pretty incredible. I made a profit as a kid. I drove a car, sold it, and did it. So I bought another car, and I drove it, sold it, did it again. Started that over again to a new thing. And it's kind of always been my mindset. I guess that just comes from my background and where I come from. And, my family has always been minded that way.
Yeah, so you were entrepreneurial from a very young age, basically.
Yeah, I mean, in a minimal way, yeah.
I mean, it is, though. When you're thinking from 18 years old, like, oh, I can make a profit at this. Like most people, the only way they see to make money is to get a job. And you've never had that attitude, it sounds like.
You know what? I've tried that route. It just was never for me. Do I still have a job? Yeah, I guess I consider it a job, but I have a lot of freedom with that job. I decided a week and a half ago that we were going to take a vacation down here, a work trip down here. Yeah, so we just decided a week and a half ago we were going to take that work trip down here, and that was that. And I have the freedom to do so because of that, and that's a wonderful thing to me. I've always been really a big fan of being able to work, and work is important, and I do work really hard when I'm working, but also really enjoying your life is part of it. It's if you can't do that, then why do all the work? It's really
Sorry, we got there's some weed whackers. We're sitting outside at the pool with their Airbnb. And the neighbors are currently having their lawn cut. And one of the interesting things in Puerto Rico is everybody cuts a lawn with a weed whacker. I've noticed this. We were just driving down the road, and even the road crews were using entirely weed whackers. I don't know if it's because we're basically on a mountain everywhere we go.
Yeah, but it seems like we're on an acre of property. You could easily do this lawn with a lawnmower in about 3.5 minutes. Instead, they're here for a half hour with a weed whacker taking care of it. There's lots of interesting things down here that get done way differently than they do at home.
Yeah, Puerto Rico. So this is one of the most beautiful places on earth. Like yesterday, we drove over to the rainforest. You jump down some waterfalls, and it's gorgeous. The beaches are gorgeous, but also it's like desperately poor in this. I don't want to call it country, territory. Puerto Ricans kind of view it as country, their own country. But everyone is ridiculously nice. But the median income here is $20,000 a year, which is like $4,000 below the U.S. poverty line.
Yeah, it's looking at statistics, it said 80% of Puerto Rico lives below the poverty line. And just thinking about that and the juxtaposition of us being here and living in, renting this beautiful place to stay in and realizing what the people around you really live like is quite different when you think about it. There's so much government reliance down here with government assistance and programs. And I mean, heck's sake, we went to the supermarket and there was a different price whether you were paying with government assistance or whether you were paying with your own money here. I found that really interesting, and not in a great way, but interesting.
Yeah. What was so that was the initial shopping trip, just stocking up the house. So the grocery bill was something like $300, which we can talk about why it gets so expensive down here. But the government assistance price was, if you were paying, it was like, what was it?
190 something?
Yeah, or no, it was like 160 or something. It was almost half priced if you're paying with fake government money, essentially.
Yeah, we find I really find it interesting down here. How much of different parts of the island rely on tourism, and that's really all there is. And I find it really interesting as well how many older people there are and how few young people there are because of how many leave the island. How many go to the mainland. As a matter of fact, I was talking to our guide yesterday who told me that there are more Puerto Ricans living in the continuous states than there are in Puerto Rico at this point.
So everybody I understand there has to be more opportunity in the continental United States than there is on this island. Other than tourism, there's no real economy here. I guess there's some coffee industry. There's some, we saw some farms on the way down, but that's probably just local beef.
They say it's the rum capital of the world, but those rum companies are not really owned in Puerto Rico. Obviously, the distillery is here, so they're pretty automated distilleries at this point. So yeah, there's some labor that works with that, and the sugarcane industry with it. But other than that, there's really not that much of an economy down here.
And so, I kind of want to talk about the Jones Act, because the Jones Act was I think it was passed in 1920, so it's 100 years old at this point. And when I was reading up on it, it was passed because some Washington state senator wanted the monopoly on shipping to Alaska. So it was corruption from the very beginning. But the Jones Act basically says, I think it's that all products shipped to U.S. ports have to be shipped from U.S. ports or some weird thing like that.
From one U.S. port to another has to be shipped on a U.S. owned, flagged, and crewed vessel. So the ship has to be built in the United States. This whole Jones Act originally was thought to be a protectionary agreement so that we maintained a maritime industry of shipbuilding. Obviously hasn't done that, as most shipbuilding at this point is done overseas. It's less than 0.5% of the ships in the world now are built in the United States. Hasn't done anything but close shipyards in the U.S. I find that amazing. All it's done really down here is cause an extreme rise in pricing of pretty much anything you buy that comes from the U.S.
It's 40% higher, basically, is the statistic I was reading, that it costs 40% more for anything shipped from the U.S. because it can't be shipped directly to Puerto Rico. So there's basically the Jones Act raises the prices dramatically in Alaska, Hawaii, and Puerto Rico. But Puerto Rico is the hardest hit because Puerto Rico it doesn't have the sustainable industry like some of those other, like Hawaii does and Alaska does.
One of the things that really surprises me here is how the tourism industry has never developed. Yeah, tourism's big here, but tourism has never developed to the level that Hawaii is. And we took a 4-hour flight here. If you and I were to take off and go to Hawaii, we're on a minimum of a 9-hour flight to Hawaii. Why would this area just have never picked up as it is? And I've got to tell you, sitting on a mountain here, looking at the ocean, it doesn't remind me of that different of a climate or environment as Hawaii is. It's just as beautiful. The surfing on part of the island is just as great. The beaches are phenomenal. There's just no infrastructure past that, whereas Hawaii has all of the infrastructure for it.
Yeah, we had to rent SUVs and Jeeps to be able to get around because the roads are falling apart.
I had originally rented a convertible. I thought, well, coming with the family, we're going to go on vacation. This is awesome. I mean, work trip, obviously. But we were going to go here and rented a category when I got to the airport and rent a convertible. Everybody I had talked to had said, oh, you're going to Puerto Rico? Yeah, don't rent a sports car. Don't rent a convertible. Don't be too flashy. And you probably want an SUV because the roads are really bad. I thought, this isn't going to be that bad driving through San Juan at first. But man, when you leave San Juan, those roads are really terrible. And it's almost a necessity.
Yeah, we're over here in Fajardo. Everybody correct your pronunciation. And it's kind of funny because I still can't get it right.
There's about 10 different people who said it 10 different ways. I'm not really sure which one of them are. I guess somebody who lives here I'll ask today.
But everybody has been incredibly nice. Like, they say don't be flashy, but I'm not sure where the criminals are. Everyone we run into has been.
I've got to be honest. Everybody here, more so than Hawaii, has been super helpful and more than willing to give you information on their island, tell you where to go, where they think the best food is, unsolicited. You don't even have to ask them these questions, and they're more than willing to say, oh, is this your first time here? This is wonderful. Come here, go there, eat here, drink here, go on this beach, take this ferry. And the people are really, really incredible people. There was a guy out in the water who was out fishing, who then had a 25-minute conversation with everything from the economy of the island, the closure of a base, the where to eat. I mean, this guy had every bit of information, as did our waiter last night. Every waiter so far has told me about what other restaurants I should be visiting. I find that level of competitiveness awesome, that they're just so willing to share what they know about their place.
Yeah, they're very proud of this island. It's just that we've basically, Puerto Rico was a colony of the United States essentially for a very long time, and it's functionally still a colony. We do not treat this island and its people are a political pawn for Washington, D.C., and it's kind of gross what we do to this place.
The colony here, and Puerto Rico has been a colony for so many years, if you think about it. Puerto Rico started out as a Spanish colony, and after the Spanish-American War, we take over the colony from them, which we can talk about the actual origins of the Spanish-American War, which are incredible. But we take over from them, and essentially it's our colony after theirs, although we don't call it a colony. We don't own colonies, sir. We have territory.
Exactly. It's a distinction without a difference at this point.
100%.
Although Puerto Ricans don't pay income taxes the same way that most people in the United States do. You do have to pay income tax, I think, if you work for the federal government, which is actually a large portion of the island. But this is why all the Bitcoiners that made their hundreds of millions of dollars in that initial wave moved down here. A lot of podcasters have moved down here. because once you're working from and inside of Puerto Rico, which you can claim to be as a podcaster, you get this at some tiny amount. I think it's no federal income tax, which is savings of literally millions of dollars a year if you're somebody like, I don't know, if Elon Musk had his Tesla factory here. Or, I think Peter Schiff is down here somewhere, and, he sells gold from Puerto Rico. So if you can work inside of Puerto Rico, you can save an incredible amount of money on taxes. On the flip side of that, the sales tax here is 10.5%. So sales tax hurts poorer people the most, essentially.
As soon as you look at your receipt, every time you make a purchase somewhere, there's 3 different tax categories on your sales receipt. I mean, the sales tax is incredible. And that sales tax isn't just charged to tourists. The sales tax is charged to people who live here as well. So yeah, while you're saving on your income tax, you're not making a lot of money, and you're also paying an incredible amount of money for everything you purchase.
So it doesn't help the people here. It's just, I don't understand why the U.S. Is it because, so there was a military base here, which was one reason to have, maintain. The U.S. loves its military bases, obviously. So they would want to maintain this for the military base. But I think you were actually here when you were 18 or something, and they closed that military base.
They
want to tell that story?
The base in Roosevelt Road. So I was in ROTC at the time, and had the option to come here on a trip. We came, and there were protests outside the base to close. Now, the group that, I've done some research on this, and the group that actually was protesting to close the base is the Puerto Rico nationalist group. So they want to nationalize and pull out of the United States, essentially be not part of the United States, and were protesting to close the base. So the U.S. military decided at some point they were done fighting it, and they closed the base here, along with the base that was on Vieques, about 5 to 6 miles away, which was a bombing test site, essentially, for the U.S. military. So that base hurt the local economy in this area where we're staying hugely, because this entire area, everybody we've talked to at some point said either they or their family had worked on that base, which, again, is essentially a fake economy. But that economy was entirely supported by the base at that point.
Yeah, and so what had happened, I believe, was a couple of kids had...
there was a worker who was killed on the base. I was actually reading about it last night, who was killed. At the time, again, I was trying to remember from years ago, so I did some research last night. There was a worker who was on the bombing range. I guess he wasn't supposed to be there at the time, and ended up getting killed on the bombing range, and by a bomb, or live fire exercise from the U.S. Navy. And they protested and used that as the reason to close the base. I'm also reading about the environmental impact of that base, which is incredible. The amount of stuff that they've left on the base there. Essentially, they closed it, and the government didn't want to pay to clean up all the areas, so they declared them wildlife-only areas, so they don't have to pay to clean them up.
Wow, that's that's exactly how you would treat a colony. Is you don't care about the people, you use it for your own purposes, you extract as many resources as you can,
and when you're done, you leave the trash.
Yeah, man. Yeah, the government's great.
And these are things that'll never get talked about outside of here because nobody cares at home. It's just a colony. It's essentially their territory. It's not a state.
I grew up in Reading, Pennsylvania, and we have a huge Puerto Rican population that had moved either, their parents were born on the island. Some of them were born here and moved to Reading because they go back and forth too. It's interesting.
And I had grown up in New York City. Same thing. People go back and forth constantly. I knew tons of people growing up that were Puerto Rican that had gone back and forth and gone back to the island, and it's insane to think about the lifestyle difference between even living in San Juan. Driving down here, there were horses walking around what looked like an apartment complex, just walking through the middle of the apartment complex. You think about that life versus the New York City life, or living in inner city Reading, and how different that would be.
Well, I mean, inner city Reading is actually not that different from inner city like San Juan. It's a very similar, not a lot of money, not a lot of jobs, a lot of people living off government programs because that's what they've been trapped into. So I do wonder, it's one of those interesting questions is we compare Hawaii and Puerto Rico because the climate is so similar, and the beaches are gorgeous here. The fishing's amazing here. But is it cultural, or is it, the colonialism that basically ruined the economy down here? It's one of those interesting questions. Like, if we left Puerto Rico alone, would it be Haiti or would it be Hawaii?
I think it's somewhere in between. I think it's similar to if you look at other islands that are down here. However, there really is not an island down here that is undisturbed, if you think about it. Every island at some point was taken over as somebody's colony, whether it was the French, the Dutch, the English, the Spanish, the Portuguese. Everybody sought a way out to go and find themselves some new territory for what was their slave colony. That's their sugarcane plantations, their tobacco industry. That's why they came here to do that. So I'm not sure you can truly compare.
Yeah, it's always an interesting question, but I also feel like it's not our business what happens. Like, I don't think we should be, because we're still exploiting this island in a lot of ways. And I don't think the tourism industry would be different, right? There's other islands down here. Even Cuba has a big tourism industry since it's been reopened.
Tourism in Cuba is huge. Tourism in Cuba has always been huge for Europeans to go. There's been direct flights from Germany, from Belgium, from France, from English tourists forever. We're the only ones who have decided we shouldn't be in Cuba. We can't go to Cuba and have tourism. The only thing it affects is really the Cubans and the Cuban people, not the Cuban government. The Cuban government has been able to maintain that entire time. It's just the Cuban people that have really suffered from it.
Free the world. I don't know. We just stick our noses in places, and it doesn't help anybody. It certainly doesn't help Americans. It's all about political interest, and it drives me crazy that why do we have the right to stick our nose in everywhere? And I know there's there's a conservative argument that we would we've improved the world so much, and I just don't see it. They claim that U.S. imperialism and even British colonialism, they go, oh, look at India. India wouldn't be what it is today without the English. And maybe, but also what right did you have to do that? Why couldn't you go in there with a free market system instead of turning them all into soldiers and slaughtering 1 million Indians as the British did in the 19th century, 18th and 19th century? Like, it just wasn't necessary.
But also, when I was doing this base research for the last day, just to learn more about that base, this base had been used to train for training for every South American and Central American and Caribbean operation we had done. Grenada, and just kind of sort of things you don't realize we have done so many, because of course they're not true wars, where these are just operations. But and that's obviously sarcastic by saying that. But we're talking about Grenada, Panama, Dominican Republic, Haiti. They've trained for all of these operations. I can't remember any one of those or the details of most of those operations at this point, but they were all training down here to do so. If you think about it, what do we really have the right to go into all these other countries? What are we maintaining by doing that? What sort of advantages are we getting from that?
Yeah, we're using a colony to train how to invade other places that we can go colonize. It's insane what the U.S. empire does and how much it costs. So, like I said, the Jones Act cost the economy here in Puerto Rico $1.2 billion a year. It just in extra fees from requiring things to be shipped from U.S. ports. And this economy, there's only 4 million people on this island. So you're not talking insignificant amounts of money to especially people making, when you say the median income is $20,000, that means most people here make around that. Now, there are some super wealthy people. It's funny. I was just out. I saw 2 Porsches today, which I haven't seen driving around here. And I was also thinking, like, why are you driving that on these roads? It just seems not the ideal car to drive down here.
It's the Range Rover I saw in Old San Juan last night definitely seemed to, I guess if you're going to buy a luxury car, that would probably be more a better advantage for you to have that than it would be some of those Porsches.
Yeah, the Land Cruiser would probably be perfect down here. It's that the Toyota that doesn't look that fancy.
Toyota Land Cruiser.
Yeah, they don't make them anymore, do they?
They actually stopped last year making Land Cruiser. It's one of my favorite vehicles ever. I mean, I know it's a large gas-guzzling SUV, but it's a wonderful vehicle to drive. I truly, truly love those trucks. They never break. It's one of the few vehicles you go around the world, and everywhere you go, you see one. They might be 50 years old, but that thing is still going, and those constantly do. Huge Toyota fan, by the way, as a car dealer. Anytime somebody asks me what to buy, my answer is always some sort of Toyota. They're just the most reliable vehicles everywhere.
So how do you think about, by the way, guys, this is just a random conversation. We're sitting at a pool in Puerto Rico, drinking rum, smoking cigars, and shooting the crap, basically. So there's not going to be maybe as many practical lessons, but this is kind of a fun conversation.
Truly unscripted here.
So I want to know, as a car guy, what do you think about, because there's a large, buy made in America cars movement, especially in the States. So what do you think about that type of imported cars versus American cars?
I mean, the idea of American-made cars at this point are sort of a joke. Yeah, the ownership of the company is American, Not in all cases, because you look at Stellantis, which is the owner of Chrysler, Dodge, Jeep. It's essentially a multinational company that's not based out of the United States. Started out in Italy and owns part of a French car company as well. But so if you look over at those American-made cars now, all you have to do is look at the window sticker, and you'll see the parts components. Most of the parts are not made in the United States. They're made outside, and even most American cars are not made in the U.S. They're made in North America, but there's so many cars at this point that are made in Canada. If you look at Chrysler, for years, if you wanted to buy what you would think the most American car is, right? The Dodge Charger, the Dodge Challenger, the Chrysler 300, just things that look like square luxury American cars. Those cars are made in Canada. I find it funny because most people don't know that, but they say buy American, but you're buying Canadian. Yet you can buy a Toyota, and more than half of the Toyota models are made in the United States. Toyota Tundras are made here, whereas Dodge Ram pickups, many are made in Mexico. And I don't have an issue with that. I have an issue with people who have to boast that they bought their American-made car made in Mexico or Canada. And you could buy a Toyota, and they tell you they don't want you to drive that you can't drive that Japanese truck. It's made in Texas.
Right. Yeah, it's when you have this big of an international economy, like it's one of the nice things about the free market is if you let things just go, if you let people make their own decisions, the free market will find it's not always the most efficient path, but it's an efficient path. And then somebody can come in and compete with you and find a more efficient path. It forces your hand to compete with them.
Well, if you think about it, we had controls over how many. So the reason Toyota trucks were never made in Japan was because of the chicken tax years ago. At some point, there were too many imported trucks from Europe coming, so we didn't want to do that. So we charged them a huge tariff on their imported chickens that were coming here. Didn't know that was a thing, but apparently that's a thing. So that prevented any vehicle coming in that was a commercial truck, not a passenger vehicle, but anything that's a commercial truck from coming in the United States. And they charged a huge tariff on top of it, which essentially made it non-competitive in the market, which is why you don't see many foreign-made trucks here in commercial trucks. And the ones you do see come in all kinds of interesting configurations, which is really odd. I can tell you about that. So if you get a new Sprinter van, which are those big cargo vans that you see driving around, or any of the new Dodge vans, they're actually made by Fiat over in Europe and then brought over here. But they have to, what they used to do is come over as what they called knockdown kits, which means they have to ship the engine and the body separately than the vehicle, because then you're importing parts and not the full vehicle. So the tax isn't there on it. And then you built it in the United States, built in quotes. You put the motor that was already assembled back in the car. The other way around it is to weld in seats that are essentially literally jump seats made of tin that they would weld in the back of the car, in the back of the vehicle, to say, yep, this vehicle has seats. It's a passenger vehicle and it has a window in the back. This makes it a passenger vehicle. The second it gets here, they rip those out. That doesn't happen. They didn't have to pay the tax on it. They're just artificial price controls. For what reason? To keep your own market competitive?
Well, this is why I always, so people say, some of our socialist leaning friends complain about capitalism and all this corruption, and look at what capitalism does to the economy and the income inequality it creates. Like, we haven't seen anything like capitalism. People don't have any idea the amount of regulations and control that different government entities have over the market, but they're not even coordinating this stuff. It's just random people. When you involve politics in an economy, there's too many complex factors to be able to control top down. So what we have is not anything like a capitalist economy. Now, we have maybe more capitalism in our economy than most other countries or many other countries, but it's all the problems do not come from people being greedy and trying to exploit other people. Although you will see those in capitalism. You see them everywhere. It's human nature. But it's amplified by putting politics into an economic system.
No, when there's government officials who have the easy way to self-right themselves or help themselves, they do. I mean, that's just part of it. If you have a way to change a local law to help yourself in your locality, you do so, regardless of the fact that it doesn't help anybody else. If it affects your area, well, they can do that. It's the opposite of being entrepreneurial. It's the opposite of being capitalist. It's really a fake control.
But it's funny because, so you found your businesses, cars are extremely regulated, right? We were just describing some of the regulations on those. There's almost nothing in America more regulated than guns and alcohol, which are your other two businesses.
All over the same, and consequently, both of those from the same agency.
Right. ATF. That's a good point. I didn't even think of that. But so why did you, I mean, I guess, how do you navigate regulations? Because you've still had, successful businesses in all three of those areas.
It makes it, I mean, any business you start obviously is much easier to do when it's something you truly have interest in and it's a passion for you.
Right.
Whenever you do something that's a passion project or something that's just interesting to you, a monetized hobby that you can turn into a business, it becomes easier for you to do. Now, as far as regulations go, luckily my stepdad is the one on that side that handles all the dealings with his business with the ATF. But that's it is tough to constantly have to worry about paperwork mistakes. They view paperwork mistakes as reasons to take your business in the ATF. Can you imagine that?
It's so frustrating.
So he's an FFL, Federal Firearms Licensee, which means he's a gun dealer essentially. Along with his training business, incorporated a gun store. It's a gun store in name. It's a gun store because he has the license to be a gun dealer. It doesn't mean he actually has a storefront. Does a lot of online business and whatnot. But yeah, there's so many regulations that come along with that. The same with alcohol labeling. What can be labeled, what can't be labeled in a certain way. The only thing I can tell you is the ATF spends so much more money on the gun side than the alcohol side, that there are so many things that get through the cracks of their ridiculous ways that they want things labeled.
So because there's a difference between what the ATF regulates in alcohol and what the actual whiskey industry regulates. So American bourbon has to be in white oak, right?
Well, all of the things with regard to for whiskey regulations are still put into law and have to be approved by the ATF. They have their divisions called the TTB, which is what you send essentially a label into them to say, does this fit the category that I want it to be? If you let's say you take a whiskey and you decide to finish it in multiple barrels, you now have to submit it as a different category. It's no longer whiskey; it's a distilled spirits specialty. Essentially, you're making a liqueur. The problem is, once you go into that category, you can essentially do so many things to it and alter the whiskey that it's no longer a pure product. But whiskey is actually one of the most regulated things because of tampering pre-prohibition. So there is the Bottled and Bond Act, which essentially said that an American whiskey has to be made in one distilling season, and there are 2 distilling seasons a year. It goes in 6-month periods. So it can be made in one distilled distilling season. It has to be exactly 100 proof, and it has to be made at the same, what's called a DSP number, a distilled spirits plant number. So every distillery in the United States has a DSP, or a distilled spirits plant number. So Jim Beam has one, Buffalo Trace has one. Every single distillery has that number, and it has to be made in one place. And the government regulates all of this. In the old days, the government actually had an agent, a revenue agent, who would stay on site and was the only person who had lock access to a warehouse. They were the ones who regulated the warehouse's ability to enter and exit. You could own the warehouse as Jim Beam, but you can't go in your warehouse without the government agent saying it's okay.
That's crazy. They own, basically the government saying we own this product.
And they did that to quote unquote help you, because they wanted to regulate the industry for the people, because they were, and at some point I'll say that there was what was called rectifiers, and rectifiers were people that would buy bulk whiskey, which by the way is a huge part of the market today, and people don't realize that. Everybody thinks that every bottle is distilled by the people that are on the bottle, and it couldn't be farther from the truth. There are more brands on the shelf today that are distilled by somebody other than the bottler than there are bottles that are actually distilled by the brand itself.
So is there actually any difference between those bottles of whiskey? Like if you buy I don't know, what are two, Jim Beam or Jack Daniels?
So both of those make their own product, and that, and you know what you're getting from there. However, there are brands that are out there. There's one of the biggest bourbon brands currently. You see it at almost every bar is Bulleit.
Yeah.
Bulleit currently has a distillery, but for many, many, many years, I want to say it's 15 or 20 years, had operated fully as a bottler only. They're owned by Diageo, giant spirits company. They started by Tom Bulleit, but they got bought out by Diageo. He stayed on as a consultant, and they stayed on. and they purchased whiskey from all types of different distilleries for their products. They were made by Four Roses for a while, who distilled their bourbon. MGP in Indiana, who is the biggest independent, so they were a big independent distiller. Used to be the Seagram's plant. Seagram's went through multiple different companies, sold out, and then and went out of business, got bought out by different entities, and then distills for other people. Essentially, you tell them you want whiskey, you buy either bulk whiskey, or they will distill on contract for you, and then you can label it as whatever you want. The only difference is it says distilled in Indiana. If you ever want a tip on buying whiskey, if you look on the back of your label, short of a few micro distillers that are in Indiana, if it says distilled in Indiana, it's made by a different company than what the company on your label is. And again, Diageo contracted them to make rye. If you want to drink Bulleit rye, it's all over the place in many different bars. It was distilled in Indiana at MGP. They didn't make it. Bulleit didn't make it. And is there a difference in the whiskey? I mean, no, it's all about, whiskey can be so different. That's the nice thing about whiskey. Take bourbon and rye for an example. You can have a barrel of bourbon, and if you have 10 different barrels of bourbon and they're aged in 10 different places and 10 different warehouses, you can get completely different products out of it. For heck's sake, I've definitely gone into warehouses and tasted barrels that were located literally one next to each other, and we've opened the bung on the barrel, drew out a sample, and they tasted completely different from each other. And it's kind of the beauty of American white oak, which is regulated that it has to be an oak container. But you have American white oak, and that it ages the whiskey so nicely, but it definitely gives a big difference from barrel to barrel, and it's one of the nice parts about it. It's not great if you're trying to make a consistent product, but it's pretty awesome when you're looking for nuance and difference.
So this is a random question, but we're both libertarian or libertarian-leaning people. We would really like the government to get out of the business of regulating, but it doesn't mean we don't want standards and some type of industry regulation. So I guess for two industries, from the whiskey industry and the firearms industry, what would your ideal, because you're involved in these, what would your ideal private regulation of the whiskey industry or certification or however you want to describe it?
I mean, I really truly believe that self-regulation can be a thing in the whiskey industry. Let's take whiskey. The old days in the rectifying, the problem was people were adding bad chemicals in to make them basically take very unaged spirit and then hope to quickly age it, quote unquote. They would add everything from tobacco juice into it to different types of flavors and different type of coloring to make it look and seem like an aged whiskey. And essentially there is nothing that you can replace time with. Time is the only thing that makes whiskey taste better over time in the wood. But they did all these things, but how many times would you get a repeat customer if you had that and you got sick from what you bought? You wouldn't, right? So all these giant companies that are big distilleries, they don't want to be sued. They don't want to have these issues. I truly believe you can self-regulate in the market.
So what do you do with the bathtub type gin person that's selling it? Because this is the argument. I'm playing devil's advocate a little bit. The bathtub gin that you're going to go blind. That was the whole propaganda essentially during Prohibition, is that if you drink this gin, you can go blind. And some people did distill it so poorly that it happened. It wasn't a total fiction. But
if you think about the reasons why they were distilling bathtub gin, it's because they weren't allowed to distill in the open. You had to distill in private. You had to obtain maybe grains that were not as good as they could have been. You couldn't use your giant stills that were great stills for rectifying spirit and producing and distilling spirit. You had to do these things in private. You had to do them away from the government's eye. That if you were able to do it in the stills you could, naturally you would.
Right. It's the same problem we have right now with fentanyl. Nobody wants fentanyl. I mean, I guess there are some people that do, but for the most part, if they could get regular quality heroin, a lot of these people would go through a phase and get off heroin. But we wouldn't have the overdose problems we'd have now. But by banning it, you make this black market where everybody does shady things. You don't know. There's no way of actually, like, you could create a private industry or private company that goes and certifies whiskeys, and it would they could sell their certification to the company, and it's a trusted company, and there could be multiple of them, and you could probably get certified by multiple companies and have several seals on your label.
You could have that, and the industry would as a whole come and look at those bottles, and as a consumer, you would start to recognize that if you looked at that, well, this is a sign of quality. This name means it's a quality, and if I see a product and it doesn't have any of that, well, you probably know you're taking a risk.
It's one of the problems with government regulation is that people rely on it too much, I think.
So the government regulation with regard to the whiskey industry, the problem with it as of today is, yeah, they don't have those government agents there anymore at the warehouse, but the government today basically is just taking the taxation off of it without really providing anything for it. So the government today is essentially these companies all are self-regulated now. They don't take samples of your whiskey and test it to make sure it's 100 proof. They don't actually see that it was warehoused in the same warehouse. They rely on the company to tell you that they've done so. They're essentially allowing the companies to do it freely anyway, but still charging the same taxation on the barrel that they that they were when they had a revenue agent parked at your warehouse.
Well, once you have a tax in place, it never goes away. I was doing research a while ago on the income tax in the United States. And when it was originally, there was a constitutional amendment passed in 1913 under Woodrow Wilson. 16th Amendment, I think. I might be wrong on that, but that legalized, because there had been a income tax that had passed Congress in the 1880s or 90s, and it was shot down by the Supreme Court as unconstitutional. So they had to come in and pass a constitutional amendment to get the income tax legal. And when they passed it, they promised, this is 1% on people under $20,000, which $20,000 in 1913 was the equivalent of I think it was like $300,000 or $400,000 today. So like 1% on up to $400,000, and then 2% on anything above that. So it was promised as a tax on the rich. And then within 5 or 6 years, by the end of the Wilson administration, it was up to 10%. So these things go so fast, they can never let go of a tax.
Take public projects for an example. We have publicly funded bridge projects. I grew up in New York, and the Verrazano Bridge, when I was growing up, I remember my parents telling me about it, that they said they were going to take essentially it's a tax, but it's a toll for the bridge off when they paid the bridge off. They're at the point now that they pay the bridge off every 4 to 5 days in what the actual money they take in. And that's not paying it off in the money from the 60s when it was built. That's taking today's money and still converting it up. They pay for it every few days, essentially, and that tax has never gone away. That toll has never gone away on that bridge. The government charges you to use that bridge there, and yeah, you could say they maintain it, but if that was a privately owned bridge and there was a toll, I guarantee you one thing: the bridge would be maintained better, the bridge would be in better service, and the bridge would probably have less traffic, because at some point they just add to it if they needed to. If traffic problems, if there became a reason to expand it, they would.
I was talking last night about Robert Moses and how he built up New York back in the so he did all these bridge and tunnel projects. He was basically the architect of New York City. We wouldn't have the New York we have today without Robert Moses, which is both a very good and very bad thing, right? What did he do? He flooded Central Park because they had told black residents that they could have this kind of free market, and we'll give you this area. And then all of a sudden, the black residents started doing too well. So they flooded them out and built Central Park on top of it.
Yeah, they literally built Central Park into what was an area where people lived, and made it this beautified park. And they talked to Big Game about how it was going to be this beautiful park and this and that, and that's the reason they did it. But realistically, it put a divide in between part of the city where you didn't want people to go. It's the same reason they put train viaducts in certain areas. It divided off a part of the city where you just literally couldn't cross. It's the same reason why there's I'm kind of weirdly interested in public transit. I've always kind of found it fascinating on how public transit and the train systems work. But you think about New York, there is no transportation that goes interborough. There's no transportation that goes from borough to borough, because again, that's where the common people have to go. The only transportation they have is into Manhattan. So while you think there's a giant transportation system, it's very inconvenient, because a lot of it just makes giant loops that have to go into Manhattan and then back out to the boroughs. There is no interborough transportation, and that's purposeful. That was always done that way because you didn't want, the poor people didn't have to get from one neighborhood to another. We just need you to get downtown to work.
You're right. So it's always funny when we talk about highway systems and train systems so we wouldn't have had, it challenges my libertarian beliefs. It doesn't challenge them, but it's a point against them that the U.S. highway system is one of the wonders of the world. We were the first to really build it up. Well, I guess the Germans did too, around the same time. But they had a much smaller country to work with. We built one of the most amazing highway systems, and it just wouldn't have happened with purely capitalistic incentives.
No, but you can take the train system, and today's train system, like it or not, would be non-existent again without capitalism, because all the trains were built that way. The government never had an interest in building all those items. They only took them over when there were problems, much of which because of overregulation. that happened. So for years with the train system, all of the like the Penn Central Railroad, which was a combination of the Pennsylvania Railroad and the Central New York Railroad, the reason that went under, all these railroads were required to keep non-profitable routes in motion. So if you had a route that went from Boise, Idaho to Minnesota, for whatever reason that route was already established, the government required that you kept that route system going the entire time, and you could not run a train on that system. So yeah, you had your profitable routes, but you were required to keep 10 other routes that didn't make a profit and didn't have ridership. Let's just say what the truth of it is, it didn't have ridership. If it had ridership, there would be a profit there. There is no profit because there's no ridership. But the government required, if you wanted to run your other profitable routes, you had to keep these non-profitable routes on. So then when the Penn Central goes bankrupt, essentially that's when Amtrak and Conrail get formed. Both government, and they're some of the most confusing things ever because they're not government, but government-owned railroad companies.
Yeah, the weirdest situation in the world is you're in this limbo of if you can't say you're a totally private company, you're not at all a private company.
You're not. You have to, because even Amtrak. So you talk about Amtrak today, and Amtrak makes profit on one section of track, and that's from Boston to D.C. That's it. And the Philadelphia to New York part of the track is the only area that actually has a huge amount of ridership. D.C. to Philly does too. D.C. to New York does, but the Philly New York one is the biggest ridership in there. But they maintain how many other trains throughout the country that either don't make a profit or don't pay for themselves. I'm not even saying they have to make a profit, but they don't pay for themselves. And if there's no ridership on them, because there's no reason to use them, let's face it, we can take a plane most other places for way less money. And Amtrak at this point, especially the cross-country trains, are basically, for the commuter service, I think they're actually really useful. To go to New York from Philadelphia, it's very easy. I go to 30th Street Station, get on the train, end up in New York. It's pretty convenient, actually. When you're leaving, and that one consequently makes a profit and pays for the rest of the Amtrak system. But when you look at the trains that go from New York to California, or you have to stop in Chicago, there's a California to a New York train, there's also a California to Chicago train. Those trains lose money all the time, and there's no ridership on them. Well, because we've invented a better system at this point. You can get an airline ticket. I mean, there's times I've looked at airline tickets that are $150 to get to California, and you're there in hours, not days. At this point, it's just it's essentially no different than a nostalgic, fun railroad for geeks that like riding on the train. It might be interesting to do the trip, but there are more efficient ways to make these things happen, and industry has shown that works. Whereas like the cargo train system works because there is not a time system on a lot of the time, non-time sensitive cargo is very efficiently shipped via rail. So that works for a reason.
Right. And so the cargo rail system is interesting because a large portion of what they ship is oil. And the oil could be more efficiently shipped through pipelines.
But we won't allow the pipelines to be built.
Right. So we don't, again, it's one of those things where we don't allow a free market to just take place.
Most of these, so in this area, it's a lot of oil. Well, say this area, the East Coast, it's a lot of oil. Central and the West Coast, it's mostly coal that gets shipped still. And a lot of that coal now has shifted to being exported as opposed to being burned here because we can't burn coal for energy. But it's still mostly coal moving. So they're slow moving trains, but they make a profit because they've honed that system so well that they know exactly how to ship them. They're on huge trains, they move at slow speed, but they get where they have to go, and that's why these companies are able to operate these rail lines.
It brings up, I was just thinking when you were talking about it, one of the things that, I don't usually talk politics on this, but we're here, so we're just having fun. Let's talk politics. One of the things that Robert Kennedy has been saying, the Democratic now presidential candidate, is that he's the first Democrat in my lifetime that I can remember pointing out the insane corruption of the marriage of big business and big government. So I guess, what do you think of Robert Kennedy's campaign? What do you think of this political season in general?
I mean, for the last couple of cycles here, at least on national election cycle, I'm not going to say much about Robert Kennedy's campaign at this point. I've just not researched enough on his positions. However, looking into this election cycle, like the last few, I'm always left puzzled at what the candidates we have to look at are. And maybe this is a different candidate you can look at and say, okay, for a mainstream candidate, this is somebody who has some okay ideas. It probably won't be. But it just blows my mind when you look and we end up with, I don't have to name the specifics, but we can go back the last national election cycles and How did we end up with those as our options every time? There's nobody younger, nobody with different experience, nobody. I mean, it's it's why our last president elected, he was the only one who isn't in that system, regardless of whether you like his positions or not. I'm not even going to talk about that, but he was certainly an outsider and acted like so.
And then he hired all the insiders, and
yeah, we're going to drain the swamp, but we're going to fill the swamp back in with the swamp.
Yeah, it's frustrating because every time that you have, and I didn't have a lot of hope for, like, I did not vote for Trump ever. I understand his appeal to certain demographics and people, and like why his like messaging worked. And I did appreciate he is hilarious, just objectively.
Oh, it was like watching comedy on a daily basis. I mean, every night you could tune in and go, wow, I can't believe that got said. But it's also better than hearing that your president shit his pants at the Vatican. That's also comedy in a different way.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't think anybody competent, like anybody that had real things going on, like this is the amount of self-sacrifice it would take, because you could only be a one-term president to make any positive change. Trump got in and the CIA undermined him from every step that he took. Like, you don't have a chance unless you're, I don't know, you need a backbone made of steel, and I still don't think you'd be able to make a difference.
I just think the system is too big around you. You were just not able to make a difference. You could surround yourself with appointees that you choose, and there's just too many other factors there that you'll never get to the point that you want to get the things you want done. And we have a large, inefficient system that doesn't allow for that to happen. There's too many controls over that.
So we got to wrap up soon because we're about to head on a boat and go snorkeling. But I guess, do you believe that, so one of the things that I think is going to happen is the system is going to fall apart. And so the big corporate jobs with all the benefits are not going to be there anymore. I don't think this government is going to, I think we're going to fracture into, I don't know. I see this country splitting apart. It almost has to.
I mean, I think national divorce is the nice way that things happen.
Right. But do you see it, like, how close do you think we are to that point? Because I see it as an inevitability at some point, but...
I think there's just the Band-Aid system. We have a giant box of Band-Aids, but eventually you run out of Band-Aids, and the Band-Aid factory closes.
There's too many regulations in the Band-Aid factory. It's not profitable at all.
You're just putting constant Band-Aids on things rather than going back and fixing structural problems. And the reason we don't fix the structural problems is because there's too many regulations around the things that we don't want to fix, essentially.
Yeah, what do you think?
Do I think time-wise? I mean, I would like to think it's, probably within 20 years. I don't know if that's realistic. I'm just not sure what the next fix is. I think you get delays as you get different people with some fresh ideas that come in and sell you on these fresh ideas and never get them enacted. There's always that what do we call it? The hope campaign, We have hope that this will change. We have hope this is going to change. But essentially you get in, and I believe these politicians get in, even the ones that are not in the system to start, get in and immediately sort of see what the system is built to be and change their ideas to back to the system rather than actually enact the things that they wanted to or they ran on. Let's face it, there's, using a project here in Puerto Rico. I had a conversation last night. I went out with a girlfriend, and we went out and watched a local band play like what they described as traditional Puerto Rican music here. It's pretty awesome. I can't tell the difference, to be honest with you, from the music I heard in Cuba that was the same when I visited Cuba and the Dominican. This all sounds very similar to me. I enjoy it. We enjoy dancing to it, but that's kind of what it is. But he was talking about the Metro project in San Juan. So apparently they have a subway system that serves almost nobody because it goes between some cities that there was a politician that lived in a city and he wanted to get elected, so he claims he's going to run a subway system from San Juan to another city that's right outside of San Juan. Doesn't really serve anybody, doesn't go in the tourist areas, doesn't connect to the airport, basically does nothing that metro systems should do. But he sold the entire area on this project and then got the project built. By the way, in record time, 6 years, he told me this entire subway system was built. I think that's incredible because in the States, we would, if we wanted to put a subway extension in New York City, some of those projects take forever. But he did this entire project and basically took the money for it. And the project went in, serves nobody, and it's a useless project, again, like most other things that get built down here with government funding. Again, if that was a private subway system, guess what it would have to do? actually serve areas that needed service and to make a profit.
And never would have been put in the first place.
Yeah, correct.
Yeah, I don't know. I think, again, the answer to all of this is not, I don't think we can make that much change at a national level. Like, you and I can talk about this all day, and we do, oftentimes.
We do often. There's many different bottles of different spirits and cigars and conversation that happen.
But yeah, at the end of the day, what it takes is the ability to hustle, and people are going to have to figure this out on their own. I don't think the government's going to be there to protect people as long as some people, whether that's through massive austerity programs and we get some crazy right-wing government in that, a lot of bad things come with crazy right-wing governments, but they will patch up some certain economic aspects, but the pain that's going to come along with it is going to be incredible. And I just, like, the reason I started this podcast is I want people to start preparing now. Like, you have to be able to, you turn your hobbies into businesses. You love cars, you turn that into a very profitable business. So I think people need to be able to figure things out on their own, and just not enough people are prepared to take care of themselves, because we've had 90 years of the government taking care of people, without whether or not they want to be taken care of. Eventually, when the government is giving you all your money and your food and your security, you stop being able to fend for yourself. And I think people are very quickly going to have to learn to fend for themselves again.
Well, I mean, it's the same idea. If you're, if you take a wild animal versus a domesticated animal and you leave them, I mean, I have a dog, love him, it's a great dog, but I mean, if I let him outside, I don't think he'd survive a day without me.
You have a 13-year-old Basset Hound.
He turned 14 last week, that guy, yeah. But, he relies on me he relies on me to give him his medicine. He relies on me to feed him. I don't think he'd know how to go out and hunt something. I mean, he's a Basset Hound. He sits there and he's a great companion. That's about it. But he has no reason to go out and look for that, My girlfriend has a dog that came off the streets. Literally, she rescued the dog off the street. He now lives with her. That guy is in the backyard hunting every day. I know it's an odd analogy to put out there, but my dog has never had the reason or need to hunt. He grew up with a family that constantly fed him, gave him love, hugged him, whatever, always constantly attention. Her dog, on the other hand, grew up on the street and literally goes out and hunts in the backyard on a daily basis and brings us his prizes. He has a reason to do it. He has the drive. Literally, he has the drive. Mine doesn't. My dog is a great companion, and that's it.
So, ladies and gentlemen, in conclusion, be the street dog. Don't be the Basset Hound. Joe, thanks so much for doing this. It's been a lot of fun.
Good conversation. Looking forward to it.
All right, man. Let's go snorkeling. All right, everybody. Stay free.